I'm just going to move over here. Sarah is the Chief Executive of Pink Hope, a patient-focused organisation supporting families with hereditary cancer risk. Give Sarah a round of applause. Welcome, Sarah. And Matt Dunn is a Professor of Paediatric Haematology and Oncology Research at the University of Newcastle and the Hunter Medical Research Institute. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for being here. So I'll start with Sarah. So you were diagnosed with breast cancer yourself at the age of 29 and then found out you had the BRCA1 mutation, and now you're heading up Pink Hope, which is a charity which supports people with an inherited cancer risk. Can you just talk to the audience, tell us a little bit about your story, but given it's your charity to do with breast cancer, some people might be saying, well, that doesn't sound like a rare cancer to me. But when we were talking, you were saying, what does genetically inherited breast cancer, how does it differ from other breast cancer risk, which is more common?
Yeah, so I did have a few concerns yesterday. I said to Sophie, our community, the cancers that we are more likely to get aren't necessarily the rarer ones, although ovarian cancer is classed as less common. But in our community, we're born, so we've inherited a known cancer genetic mutation like BRCA, like me, but we know there are many others. Or we actually have a lot of people in our community that have a really significant family history of breast, ovarian and prostate cancer mainly. I guess what makes us rare, I think, number one, is that we're born that way. That's, and we basically spend our life fighting cancer and doing everything we can to reduce our risk of cancer as much as possible. So I think that's kind of where we fit into the conversation, but really acknowledging that obviously it's quite different to some of the stories that I've heard today. I said to someone last night, cancer, all cancer is horrible and devastating for families. And I think we're lucky we have so many support organisations that can help the different types of cancer and how it affects people.
And thank you, Sarah. Before we move on to Matt, I just wanted to ask you, what are the most pressing needs when it comes to people at high risk of hereditary cancers? What are the specific issues and their most pressing needs?
Yeah, like all sort of communities and cancer types, we do have quite a few issues. One that we're all aware of at the moment is insurance discrimination. No one should be discriminated against because of their genetic makeup. So hopefully that's something that will change in the near future. I think that one of the biggest things we see in our community is the wait lists in public hospitals. We give people this incredible information, and sometimes I think genetic testing can really be thought about quite clinically. Do we have the workforce to enough genetic counsellors to give that person the result? Can the labs, how quickly can they turn the results around? But, giving that person the result, that's just the beginning of the rest of their life, managing that risk. And, you can give someone this incredible information and it's, that they know now that they're at a really high risk, and they'll go into a public system and wait a minimum of 18 months to be able to have a mastectomy to reduce that risk. Often people are waiting longer. So we see women getting breast cancer while they're waiting. Which to me is just, that we know these people are at very high risk, or they access their super, or they borrow money, or, they get into debt because they don't want to wait in the public system. So that's definitely a huge challenge.
Okay, look, thank you for sharing that, Sarah. So, Matt, thank you for being part of our panel. Now, your research focuses on treatments for high-risk children's cancer with poor outcomes, in particular the brain cancer DIPG. But can you tell us your personal connection about your daughter, Josie?
Sure. So prior to 2018, I was focused on leukemia cases that generally did poorly. So a patient with leukemia that doesn't respond to upfront chemotherapies tends to do very poorly. And research from the Children's Cancer Institute and more broadly at St Jude have really identified markers of minimal residual disease, which gives us early indications that we need to change treatment approaches. And so I was really focused on cancers that didn't respond. Had a nice little research group at the Hunter Medical Research Institute at the John Hunter Children's Hospital. And then in 2018, my daughter was diagnosed with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, which is a brainstem cancer that's diagnosed in between 20 and 25 children in Australia each year. is a devastating cancer that's really treatment refractory. It doesn't respond at all to chemotherapy. And so families and children are faced with palliative radiotherapy as the only treatment. And that was what my wife and I were facing back in 2018 when I was at work on a Saturday writing grants to keep the team going, and my wife, who's a general practitioner, rang me and said that Josie was unable to walk, and she was very concerned about her. And we happened to be living with my parents-in-law, who my father-in-law is also a GP for 47 years, and he was equally worried. And I rendezvoused with them at the John Hunter Children's Hospital, and I could see that everything that was unfolding was of great clinical concern. And we had a fantastic neurologist on that day who had trained with my father-in-law at Sydney Uni all those years ago. And when he asked Josie to do this, and she couldn't quite do it, we knew things were bad. And she had an MRI that day under a general anaesthetic because she was only almost 3 years of age. And we were very worried as we were waiting outside the surgical recovery department for Josie to come out of her first general anaesthetic, the first of 60 that she would endure throughout her journey. And when that neurologist came out of surgical recovery, accompanied by the head of paediatric oncology on a Saturday when he wasn't even on, was worrying for both Phoebe and I. He was my closest clinical colleague, and he had trained Phoebe in paediatrics during her oncology training. And so, we were presented with this terrible mass in her brainstem, and we were told that Josie would leave us within a year. We enrolled on the Zero Childhood Cancer trial immediately, of course, and unfortunately we had to move to Sydney for treatment because Josie required a general anaesthetic for every session of radiotherapy that she would have. And then, we moved from Newcastle to Sydney, and during that time, I really got stuck into what is DIPG and who are the experts, and contacted some colleagues in Stanford University, and they immediately sent cells that they had grown in the lab to my lab, and we started to investigate what this thing was in the lab, and started to identify the drivers of these cancers and identify new treatments, and since then it's been a bit of a whirlwind. And to fund all of that work, initially we started a charity called Run DIPG, which funded my work in real time in the lab, and now has supported about $5 million worth of research around the world.
Wow, congratulations on all that amazing advocacy that you've done in such a upsetting circumstance. But what sort of advances have we seen since Josie's diagnosis? Has there been much in this area?
Yeah, today's been really characterised by immune therapies, and it was only 2 days after Josie was diagnosed that the leader of paediatric DIPG research worldwide, from a professor from Stanford University, Michelle Monchi, had a Zoom meeting with me, and she shared the results of her preclinical work that had explored the use of taking a patient's T cells and training them to recognise the tumour and then re-injecting them back into a mouse model. And that had cured all of the mice, except some had died of brain swelling or hydrocephalus, which she was very worried about. And it was that information that kind of really gave me hope that there was a chance we could beat this disease. And throughout Josie's journey, it was pretty much my one ambition was just to keep it going long enough until we could get the CAR T therapy trials open in Australia. And working with Professor Ziegler, who's the head of DIPG research at Children's Cancer Institute and Sydney Children's Hospital, the ambition was to get the trial here. It took much longer than anticipated, but we did a lot for Josie during her journey. We identified a lot of drivers and new therapies that have now been tested in children, and unfortunately she passed away 2 years after diagnosis.
But I'm sure, as a dreadful, sad story for you, Matt, but I'm sure all the families who are dealing with this really appreciate all the efforts you're putting in, and that you've devoted so much of your career now to this and so much advocacy in this space. So we really thank you and appreciate that. Emily, can I talk to you about your journey? And one thing that I wanted the audience to know as well, you talked a lot about in your presentation of what you've been through. But one thing that you didn't mention was the other things that you're doing as well, which is training in the Warrior Games, and you achieved personal bests in powerlifting, indoor rowing, athletics, while dealing with cancer. And Rare Cancers Australia has a saying that people are more than their cancer diagnosis. And I wanted to just get you to reflect to the audience, how important is that concept and that mindset been for you when navigating your cancer journey?
Yeah, sure. So I think I joined the Army because somebody told me I wouldn't pass basic training because it was apparently hard. So I think pre-cancer, that says a lot about my mindset, and that I think, dare I say it, just the natural level of resilience that I had. After I was diagnosed, I focused on what I could control. So I had long brown hair, I cut it into a bob and then shaved it because it was going to go anyway during chemo. I have grasped onto those things that remain in my control. As cancer patients, we know that cancer removes a lot of the control over what you have of the day-to-day. One thing that I have been able to control is parts of my well-being, my physical well-being, and yeah, part of that is being able to keep fit and maintain a healthy level of fitness despite a cancer diagnosis. In my presentation, I mentioned that one of my symptoms was loss of vision in my left eye, and unfortunately my optic nerve was severed due to tumour pressure and wasn't able to be saved. So I don't have any vision in my left eye. So that has meant that a lot of my day-to-day activities have need to be adapted. The Australian Defence Adaptive Sports Program supported me on the journey to the Department of Defence Warrior Games in June, July this year. So for those that don't know, the Warrior Games is more or less the United States iteration of the Invictus Games. And yeah, I'm hoping to head to Invictus Games in Canada in February next year. So it just goes to show that despite cancer, despite a terminal illness, that with the right support, the right treatment, and the right mindset, that you can still live
Give Emily a round of
meaningful
applause
and well life.
on you. Thank you, Emily. So David, I might just ask you, in the report that's come out today, we talk about clinical trials and it needs to be the standard of care, but at the moment clinical trials are only being accessed by about 8% of patients. How do we make it a reality that more patients get access to the best clinical trials? In particular, more patients get access to the future that you explained in your presentation.
Well, it's a complicated problem. We have a healthcare system which is not designed to make clinical trials a priority. So they're regarded as nice to have but not essential. And the healthcare system, as I've commented, is quite slow to change. And I think the relatively recent emergence of much more effective, much more greater probability of benefit from participating in clinical trials is only recently appreciated. I think people still think that taking part in a trial is being a guinea pig, which nothing could be further from the truth. All of these trials are at least as much about the person that takes part in them as they are about answering a question about a future treatment. And I think that change that's required to do that is quite challenging for a number of reasons. One of them is obviously resourcing. That if you don't have resources placed towards supporting clinical trials to the same extent that you would a standard of care treatment, then you do bedpans and make sure you've got gurneys that work, and you solve all the urgent problems that always get between the present and the strategic. The other thing is, of course, working with industry, I think, is a really interesting challenge. I think the healthcare system tends to see itself as being entirely about the public sector, but in fact, we have a model in which all ideas progress through 3 phases, where the intellectual property is often generated by researchers such as Matt in the research laboratory. Those ideas get taken up where they're promising for industry to develop the drugs and then run the trials, and then it comes back into the public sector as standard of care treatment. And that relationship is very segmented and siloed and inefficient, incredibly inefficient, which is good news, because the fact that it's so inefficient means that there are obvious points of making it much more efficient by a more integrated approach. And so I think, and of course there are many other reasons why that's important, not the least of which is the fact that the life science is one of the biggest industries on the planet and will employ a lot of Australians if we can make it work. Once we've dug up all the iron ore and shorn all the sheep, we'll have to think about a future in which perhaps our smartest and brightest can actually invent futures that the rest of the world can become involved in. And obviously molecular infrastructure is a key part of that. If all of drug development is rational and based around a molecular view of cancer, the fact that we don't have routine access to it means that companies actually have to pay for the profiling. Well, why would you do that in Australia when you can do it at Memorial, where it's done, through massive charities and other mechanisms at single institutions? As a public health issue, provision of that infrastructure would enable more trials to be conducted in this country, which would otherwise be simply impossible. Omico's current prospect program has been going for about 15 months, and we have supported 11 trials which simply would not have come into the country because it would have been impossible to find the patients with the relevant targets. And all of those trials are very promising, opening up new areas for cancer patients. So I think what we badly need is the topic of discussion today. We need to have genomic profiling as a standard of care, if only because the future is coming so fast that only through trials can we access it credibly today. That 450 days between getting on the PBS, there's nothing that fills that gap at the moment other than clinical trials, compassionate access, and people paying out of their own pockets, which is not the basis for equitable healthcare.
Thanks, David. And Matt, I might just go to you to stick with clinical trials for a minute. How do we create more inclusive and patient-centred clinical trials so that it's really thinking about the patient's needs rather than just the patient having to fit in to whatever the parameters of the clinical trial, how narrow they might be?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. I mean, I think we're at a critical time in our aggressive brain cancer clinical trial landscape, where in Australia we now have trials outside of the Zero Childhood Cancer Program, precision medicine program, that are testing targeted therapies, that are testing immunotherapies. But what often happens for these patients, because it is such an aggressive unrelenting disease, is that patients will enrol late onto a trial. They will progress while they wait for their slot to become open, and then that will make them ineligible. Their performance scores...
So they become too sick to...
Yeah, they'll become too sick, Their performance scores will, mean that they're not eligible for these early phase trials. I mean, I kind of feel in these early phase settings that our primary endpoint for these trials, of course, is always going to be safety and tolerability, should also be the number of patients that we get onto trials, and that we should include arms if we're designing these trials, or if we're importing trials from overseas, that has an arm that means that patients can just receive therapy at any stage of their journey, so that all families feel like they've done absolutely everything they can, and their clinical teams are armed with something for every patient. Too often we see patients that are rural and remote that are waiting to get on a trial progress whilst they're waiting, and then they never receive any therapy throughout their journey, and that's really heartbreaking for the family. The families feel like they haven't done anything to help their children, and I can imagine from the clinical perspective not being able to enrol that child or not being able to treat their child because they're not fitting performance scores, but the drugs are there, they're in the centre, and they're the next patient in line.
So we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to just go to some audience questions. There's one for Kim, and they're asking, Kim, do you feel that the Australian Cancer Plan has the workforce requirements adequately covered, especially in relation to genomics?
Well, I
think that sounds like a no. And if not, what would you like to see then?
Well, I mean, the cancer plan is a plan and it's a framework to inform. So it hasn't got the nuanced details of those exact requirements. But I think we need to engage the workforce first and foremost. And so when I look at from a nursing perspective, it's often that it's the last minute funding comes in. Oh, and by the way, can the nurses do something? It's an afterthought. And yet if I talk to anybody, any lab scientist, any scientist really that deals with people in the clinic, if you ask them about their team, do you have a nurse on your team? Oh, yes. They were the one that actually enabled that the blood sample got from here to here, but they're not necessarily listed as a lead investigator or contributing in that way. And, from a nursing perspective, I'm not saying that that's what they want their contribution to be either, but they are often a bit of an afterthought. And so I think just engaging with our workforce like we do with our consumers now and informing moving forward is equally important. But so I came at this from a nursing perspective, but this is across all workforce clinically, and it shouldn't, we're surprised, I suppose, at how people aren't aware of what genomic advancements were. And if your questions before around access to clinical trials, it's because it is seen as separate and it's siloed, and you've got the department, clinical trials doesn't even sit within the treatment modalities. And so, you know, I think we've got structural issues that also exacerbate our workforce not having access to the researchers to be able to inform their clinical care too.
So we've got a question for David Thomas, and the audience wants to know, what does PBAC think of your economic model? Have you had a chance to show them yet? And are you able to reach the decision makers who could put your plan into action?
Yes. Yes, we have, and we have shown them. I think when you're in your silo, it's easy to think that other people don't care about this problem, but I promise you there are people within the health department who are battling cancer and who care about this at least as much as the people in this audience. We all care about it. So I know that the department is thinking very hard about this problem. The whole health technology assessment review is about reflecting internally and thinking about what can be done to adapt to this obviously rapidly evolving and very promising circumstance. We have put the model to them, and in that model we've tried to specifically respect HTA, because it's reasonable to say we should have everything for everybody, but governments have to take what they have and divide it fairly as much as possible because there are so many demands. We need to respect that. But what we've got to do is be hard, really hard, when the case can be made. So we're trying to make that case as strongly as we can, and I have great faith that the department will take the view that if they're given a credible solution, that they'll have a go at it. And that's the whole idea of the health system incubator being tested. It's not a certainty, but it is something that the system needs to introduce in the same way that a trial is necessary to introduce a drug. This is a change that the system needs to contemplate. And I'm optimistic, Sophie.
Fantastic. So look, we're almost running out of time. So I wanted to go through each of the panellists and give them the opportunity to ask them what, in their view, what a better world for rare looks like. And Sarah, I'll go to you first. So for you and the patients that you support and represent, what does a better world look like for your patients that you look after?
I've got a couple, if that's okay. Yeah, sure. The first one would be that there are different ways that we can reduce our risk of cancer without having to remove parts of our body. You know, as a mum of a 17-year-old who will be eligible for genetic testing soon, you know, obviously my greatest hope is that she hasn't inherited this mutation from me. But, you know, I would love a future where the option for her isn't, you know, to reduce her risk isn't mastectomy or oophorectomy. I can't think of my other one, so sorry.
That's
we'll
all
go
right.
on to the next person.
That's all right. Matt, let's go to you. So what does a better world for rare cancers look like for you?
I mean, rare cancers are driven by rare drivers, and for the most part, we don't have the molecular targeted therapies that address these drivers. So adequate funding for research, fundamental research into developing treatments, that means that we have these precision medicines that can then assist the genomics platforms that are rolled out, so we've got effective treatments for all patients.
Yeah, so just identifying the markers is only
great,
the first step, but you need to be able to then say, okay, now we can give you this drug to do it. Sarah, did you want to have one more?
Yes, the other one was around, came to me just as you said.
You're right, all good.
At least it wasn't 3 a.m. this morning. That's it. It's around genetic testing and being, you know, enabling particularly everyone who is diagnosed with cancer access to genetic testing, but, you know, enabling our system to be able to cope with that. There was a lot of talk today about, you know, people having testing for precision medicines, you know, which was a lot of what we talked about, and a lot of people then end up getting germline results to find out they've got BRCA, and that's great for their families because they go on and have genetic testing and cascade testing. But what that creates is more and more people finding out about their risk, you know, accessing support organisations, trying to have preventative surgeries, and our system isn't able to cope with that. So that would be, you know, where everyone can access genetic testing, but the system can cope with it.
Is there to cope for them.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.
And Kim?
Oh, look, I ditto all of these other ones as well. But yeah, it really is that access to information in a timely manner so that people can make informed decisions, even if at the end of the day the information is we don't have any more information. At least they know where they stand.
Yeah, fantastic. And David, what about you? You've outlined your view of what you would like to see happen. Is that, what difference would it make if PBAC and all the decision makers listen and look at your amazing proposals and say, yep, we're going to give this a go?
Well, it will mean that when I finish my career in a few years' time, I will leave behind the landscape that's not dependent on medical research grants to find solutions for desperate people.
That sounds good. And Emily, finally?
Look, I think broadly speaking, that genomic testing and precision oncology are used as sort of a standardised, within the standardised care model ideally. And for me personally, I would like the assurance from BMS that my BET inhibitor is going to remain available. So if there's anybody from BMS here, I'd love to have a chat with you after this.
So look, thank you everybody, and look, thank you. We really appreciate all the panellists for giving their unique insights into this issue. It's been inspiring. It's a complicated topic, but I think what we've learned in this panel, particularly, is that there are solutions. There are really practical things that we can start putting into place, straight away, that will make a substantial difference to achieve that better outcomes and better access for patients, and to achieve what we've been talking about today, which is the rare cancer moonshot, where 90% of people diagnosed with any cancer would survive, despite no matter what type of cancer it is, and that we can achieve that true equity in cancer by 2035.